Right, this video is on evidence that supports evolution. We're going to look at how geologic distribution of species today relates to their evolutionary history, how fossils help document the descent of modern species. Descent with modification is how Darwin described that. What homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures tell us about evolutionary change and evolutionary relationships, and how molecular biology can be used to trace the process of evolution and support the idea of evolution by means of natural selection. And then we'll look at some of the recent research on the Galapagos finches shows about natural selection. So biogeography is patterns in the distribution of fossils and living species combined with information from, that should be geology, or geography, not geology. Tells us how modern organisms evolved from their ancestors. So it's looking at where do living things live and looking at how can we explain why we find these guys here and not here, and how that relates to evolution. So whales evolved from animals that lived on land, and this graphic kind of shows evidence from fossils, evidence, and then how they're related to the modern species of whales today. You can see how they become better adapted to life in water over time. But modern whales have ancient structures like pelvic bones and things that show us how they're still related to some of their more ancient ancestors. So homologous structures are similar structures that are shared by related species and have been inherited from common ancestors. So forelimbs of vertebrates all have some similarities. They all have one upper limb bone, the two thinner, smaller forelimbs, the wrist, palm, and finger bones, for lack of a better term. And they've been adapted for specific purposes, but they have some similarities because they're from a similar common ancestor. Vestigial structures are homologous structures inherited from ancestors, but they've lost much of their original size and function. In humans, we have ear-wiggling muscles, pelvic and thigh bones, and cobras and whales would be examples. Some things we used to think were vestigial, we found purposes for, like the human appendix, for instance, is a breeding ground for beneficial bacteria. That we, as we're starting to learn more about the microbiome, all the living things that live in our body, and how they play an important role in our health. Here's a skink with the little tiny legs you can see there in the bottom. So again, they had legs, now they don't, or they don't really work, what's left of them. Analogous structures, body parts that serve similar functions, but do not share structural and developmental similarities. They're unrelated species. They've developed a similar structure because they have a similar function in their environment. Wings of insects and birds and bats would be examples. The cacti in the southwestern US and the euphorbia in Australia. Again, they've developed similar adaptations because they live in similar environments. Embryology, development. We can see embryological similarities that we don't see in the adults. If you look at vertebrate embryos, they all have some commonalities. They all have a tail, they all have gill slits, and things like that. And again, that suggests, again, descent from a common ancestor. And finally, molecular biology. This is one of the things that Darwin didn't have access to because, again, in the 1800s, we didn't know how genetics worked. We didn't know what DNA was and how it worked. But at the molecular level, we can look at genetic code of all living things, and you see that almost all living things have the same genetic code, which tells us that there's a genetic basis to life as well as a common ancestor. There is one exception to that. The amoebas have a different genetic code, but pretty much everything else has the same genetic code. We can look for similar DNA sequences and similar proteins that shows, again, evolutionary relationships. Again, the process of DNA to RNA to protein is common to all living things as well. Darwin's finches. So as we're looking at Darwin's finches and their beak structures in particular, we're learning that they've each adapted to the food that's available on the islands, whether that's a thick seed, which gives them a short, thick beak, an insect eater that they have to use to probe into logs and things, or a skinny beak for catching free exposed insects off of surfaces, and so on.